A kingdom is a strange thing to just accept. Somewhere in the ancient past, a farmer in one town and a fisherman in another town, who had never met, who spoke slightly different dialects, who prayed to slightly different gods, woke up one morning and were told they were now the same people, same king, same laws, same taxes, same enemies. And overnight, two total strangers became countrymen, because somebody with an army, a priesthood, and a very confident attitude said so. And it wasn't a slow, gentle merger either. In most of the ancient world, becoming part of a kingdom looked less like a handshake and more like waking up to find a foreign flag over your temple and a foreign tax collector counting your grain. Here's the part that makes it stranger. Humans had already figured out how to have a ruler long before this. A powerful family running one town, one valley, one city. That had been happening for a while. But a kingdom, one ruler stretching authority over many towns, many peoples, many separate identities, stitched into a single us. That is a completely different invention. And it might be the harder one to explain. So how do you take 100 communities who have spent their entire existence minding their own business and convince them they now belong to the same thing? That question sat unanswered for most of human history. Let's go find out how it finally got answered. For a very long time, big and political unit did not go together. Even after farming, storage, and permanent towns had produced powerful local leaders, authority mostly stopped at the town gate. Picture two small settlements a few days' walk apart. Let's call them Millbrook and Reedford. Different founding families, different patron gods, different accents, different grudges going back generations. Millbrook has never paid tribute to Reedford. Reedford has never taken orders from Millbrook. As far as either town is concerned, the other one is basically a foreign country, and a slightly annoying one. This was normal. Across early Mesopotamia, early Egypt, early China, the first powerful rulers we can identify were usually rulers of one place, a city, a temple district, a cluster of villages along one stretch of river. Historians even have a name for these early miniature states. City-states. Uruk had a ruler, Ur had a ruler, Kish had a ruler, Lagash had a ruler. None of them ruled each other. And city-states did what neighbors with separate armies tend to do. They traded when it was convenient, and they fought when it wasn't. Border disputes, water rights, stolen livestock, insulted messengers. Bronze Age soap opera, basically. So if independence was the default setting, something unusual had to happen to override it. Someone had to give 100 Millbrooks and Reedfords a reason to stop being separate, permanently. There were really only two roads into a kingdom. Road 1, get swallowed. Road 2, grow together. Nobody wrote it down that clearly at the time, but archaeology has since sorted the evidence into those two piles. Let's take the growing together road first, because one of the clearest examples of it is sitting on the banks of a single, very famous river. Around 3100 BCE, Egypt was not yet Egypt. It was two long, narrow strips of farmland stitched to the Nile. Upper Egypt in the south, Lower Egypt sprawled across the river's delta in the north. Different landscapes, different economies, different symbols of power. Upper Egypt rallied around a white crown. Lower Egypt rallied around a red one. Two regions, two identities, two separate political worlds sharing one river. Then, sometime around 3100 BCE, a ruler most historians associate with the name Narmer did something that later Egyptians would treat as the actual beginning of their civilization. He took both crowns. We know this mostly from a single slab of dark stone, the Narmer palette. It is one of the most argued over objects in archaeology, and also one of the most blunt pieces of propaganda ever carved. On one side, Narmer wears the tall white crown of the south and smashes an enemy's skull with a mace, mid-swing, forever. On the other side, he wears the red crown of the north, inspecting rows of the defeated. Same king, two crowns, two regions, one object. You do not need to read a single hieroglyph to understand the message. These were two kingdoms, and now they are not. Later Egyptian kings wore both crowns fused into one, the double crown, the pskent, every single day, for the next 3,000 years. That is either remarkable political branding or the longest-running hat joke in history, possibly both. And it wasn't only the crown. Egypt built its capital, Memphis, almost exactly where the two lands physically met, the hinge point between north and south, made permanent in mud brick and limestone. A kingdom, it turns out, needs a capital that isn't obviously anybody's hometown. Put it in the wrong place, and half your new subjects will always suspect the other half of running things. Egyptian unification worked, historians think, partly because geography did a lot of the heavy lifting. One river, one flood cycle, one narrow strip of farmable land squeezed between two deserts. Egypt was almost pre-shaped to become one thing. But geography alone does not build a kingdom. Somebody still has to convince the losing side that it's over, and convince the winning side that ruling strangers is worth the trouble. That takes more than a nice river. So let's look at the other road into a kingdom, the one that doesn't wait around for geography to cooperate, the conquest road. And nobody drove down it harder than a man named Sargon. Around 2334 BCE, in Mesopotamia, the land of independent, proudly quarrelsome city-states, a ruler from the city of Akkad did something those cities had spent centuries successfully avoiding. He beat every single one of them, one after another. Uruk fell, Ur fell, Lagash fell, Kish fell. Sargon of Akkad didn't stop at biggest city-state in the neighborhood. He kept going until there wasn't a neighborhood left that wasn't his. This is usually treated as the first empire in the historical record, not because Sargon was the first person to win a war, but because of what he did after winning it. He didn't just loot Ur and go home. He installed his own officials as governors. He put his daughter in charge of one of the most important religious offices in the land. He gave himself a title that says everything about the size of his ambition: King of the Four Quarters, that is, King of the entire known world. Notice what's missing from that title. It doesn't say King of Akkad. It doesn't even bother naming a place. It claims the whole map, on behalf of a ruler whose hometown, before all this, most of his new subjects couldn't have located. Sargon's empire and Narmer's Egypt arrived at the same destination: one ruler, many peoples, from opposite directions. Egypt grew two neighbors into one identity. Akkad forced a dozen strangers into submission and dared them to complain. Which raises the obvious problem with the conquest road. Winning a war is a Tuesday. Getting 100 conquered cities to still take your orders 20 years later, after your army has gone home, that's the actual test. Plenty of ambitious men before Sargon had crushed a rival city, taken its grain, and gone back to being a slightly richer local ruler. That's not a kingdom. That's a really successful raid. A raid ends the moment the raiders leave. A kingdom has to survive the ruler going home, going old, and eventually going to his very fancy tomb. So what actually makes strangers stay stitched together? The honest answer is a surprising amount of paperwork. Kingdoms are held together less by swords than by clerks, and this is the part nobody puts on the recruitment poster. Start with governors. You cannot personally rule 200 towns, so you appoint people to rule them for you. Cousins, generals, loyal officials, and you send them out with instructions, expecting loyalty flowing back to the center. This is a genuinely dangerous move. A governor with an army and some distance from the capital is one bad year away from deciding he'd rather be a king himself. Kingdoms don't just get built, they constantly threaten to come back apart. Next, roads and messengers. A kingdom that can't communicate faster than a rumor spreads is not really one kingdom. It's several kingdoms that haven't noticed yet. Distance is the enemy of every unified state that has ever existed. Next, a shared standard. Common weights, common measures, sometimes a common script, so that a merchant, a tax collector, and a judge in one province could actually understand a merchant, a tax collector, and a judge in another. Sargon's administrators, for example, appear to have pushed Akkadian record-keeping practices into cities that had been doing things their own Sumerian way for a very long time, not because it was gentle, because it was efficient. There's also a smaller, sneakier piece of technology worth mentioning: the seal, a carved cylinder, rolled across wet clay, leaving a unique pattern that said, in effect, this document is authentic and this order really did come from the person it claims to. Trust, manufactured in stone. That sounds minor. It isn't. A kingdom is a network of strangers who mostly never meet the ruler in person. Without some physical proof that an order genuinely came from the top, every governor, tax collector, and general is free to simply claim it did. Next, tribute. Grain, silver, livestock, labor, flowing inward, from the provinces toward the capital, on a schedule. This is the actual heartbeat of a kingdom. If the flow stops, the kingdom isn't a kingdom anymore. It's a rumor with a flag. And in return for the tribute, the center is supposed to offer something back: protection from raiders, protection from each other, access to trade routes, grain reserves during a bad harvest. A kingdom, at its best, is a protection racket that occasionally delivers. None of this explains why anyone would believe in it, though. Paperwork keeps a kingdom running day to day. It does not make a conquered stranger feel, in his gut, that he belongs to it. For that, rulers needed something older and much more persuasive. They needed a story big enough to cover everyone at once. And the most reliable story available in the ancient world was, the gods already decided this. In Egypt, the pharaoh wasn't merely in charge of two formerly separate lands. He was Horus in human form, the living link holding cosmic order together, for the north and the south equally. Loyalty to Egypt wasn't politics, it was physics. In Mesopotamia, rulers leaned on their local gods to bless expansion, framing conquest as restoring order rather than simply seizing property. One of Sargon's own successors, Naram Sin, eventually had himself depicted wearing a horned crown reserved for gods, placing himself, visually, above the entire hierarchy he ruled. This is the actual trick underneath every early kingdom. Convince Millbrook and Reedford that they were never really separate, that some larger order, older than either of them, always intended them to be one thing. Suddenly resistance doesn't just look risky, it looks blasphemous. Rulers backed the story up with things you could physically see: a shared temple, a shared festival calendar, a capital city so large and so strange that visiting it felt like visiting the center of the universe. Monumental buildings did real political work here. A wall around a single town says "keep out." A temple complex, a palace, a set of royal tombs rising in the middle of a unified kingdom says something closer to, you already belong to this, whether you remember agreeing to it or not. And then, the quiet trick that made the whole thing outlast any one lifetime: intermarriage. Elite families from formerly rival regions started marrying into each other, generation after generation, until asking, which side is your family really from, stopped having a clean answer. A generation raised on mixed ancestry, a shared crown, a shared temple calendar, and a shared tax collector does not experience the kingdom as an occupation. It experiences the kingdom as simply how the world has always worked. That's the actual finish line. Of course, none of this made kingdoms stable. If anything, the bigger the kingdom, the more spectacular the ways it could fail. Distant governors could rebel, conquered cities could revolt the moment an army looked weak, succession disputes could tear a unified crown into rival claimants overnight. Sargon's own empire had to be fought for, again, by his sons, and put down rebellion after rebellion for generations. Being king of the four quarters, it turns out, mostly meant being at war with at least one of them at any given time. Egypt fared better for a while, helped enormously by geography. Deserts on both sides made it much harder for outsiders to march in, and much harder for the two halves to drift apart once fused. But even Egypt eventually split, reunited, split again, across 3,000 years of the same basic tug-of-war. Egypt actually proves this the hard way. Around 2181 BCE, roughly 9 centuries after Narmer's two crowns became one, the unified kingdom simply came apart. Regional governors stopped forwarding tribute to the capital. Famine and weak central authority did the rest. For over a century, Egypt was Egypt in name only, a patchwork of local rulers, each acting like a king in his own province, while the double crown sat on nobody's head that everyone agreed on. Historians call it the First Intermediate Period. Ancient Egyptians probably called it a mess. It took a ruler named Mentuhotep II, around 2055 BCE, to fight his way through those rival provinces and physically restitch Upper and Lower Egypt back into one kingdom, repeating, almost exactly, the trick Narmer had pulled off 900 years earlier. Same river, same two lands, same story, reinstalled. So even the tidiest, most geographically obvious kingdom in the ancient world wasn't a one-time invention. It was invented, it broke, and somebody had to invent it again. That, more than any crown or palette, tells you what a kingdom actually is. So maybe the more honest way to describe a kingdom isn't a solved problem. It's a constant negotiation, wearing a crown, pretending to be finished. Every kingdom that ever lasted was really just a kingdom that kept re-winning the same argument, generation after generation. Which brings us back to Millbrook and Reedford. Somewhere, eventually, a version of that story played out for real. Two proud, separate little worlds, each convinced the other was foreign, ended up sharing a capital, a currency, a crown, and eventually, a grandchild. Nobody in either town voted for that outcome. It arrived through some mixture of conquest, marriage, tribute, temples, and a story patient enough to outlive everyone who remembered a time before it was true. And that, more than any single battle or any single crown, is the actual invention we're talking about. Not a bigger army, not a taller throne. The invention of us, stretched, deliberately, dishonestly, and permanently, over people who never chose each other. It's worth noticing how differently this ends from the story of the king himself. A king is one dramatic decision, a group deciding to kneel to one man. A kingdom is 1,000 smaller, quieter decisions, repeated for generations, by people who never met the man they were kneeling to. That's really the whole shift. Kingship answered the question of who's in charge. Kingdom answered a much bigger question underneath it: who counts as us in the first place? And once that question had an answer, it rarely shrank back down again. We still live inside that invention. Modern nations are not ancient kingdoms, but they run on the exact same trick. Millions of strangers, different accents, different hometowns, agreeing to share a flag, a capital, and a story about who they've always been. So the next time you look at a map and see one solid color stretching across dozens of cities that never asked to be neighbors, remember what you're actually looking at, not a natural fact, an old, extremely persuasive story that eventually everyone simply stopped questioning.